the tiny mountain town that tied a nation together. The true story of Soda Springs, California, and the hand-dug tunnel beneath the snow that nobody counted the cost of. High in the Sierra Nevada, where Interstate 80 climbs over the granite spine of California, there is a place most travelers pass at 70 miles an hour without ever knowing it is there. In winter, it nearly disappears. Fence posts vanish, road signs sink under the drifts, and the wind drives snow sideways across the pass. In summer, the rock comes back, polished, pale, and smooth by long-gone glaciers. The first people here left their marks on that stone. The railroad men named a station for a spring that bubbled up a few miles away. A railroad tycoon turned that spring into a playground for the rich, and one stubborn family turned the station into the birthplace of an entire California pastime. This is Soda Springs, a speck on the map of Nevada County, and one of the most important mountain crossings in the history of the American West. Beneath its snow lies a tunnel dug by hand, the link that finally tied the country together. What it cost in human lives, nobody bothered to write down. Long before there was a railroad, or a highway, or a name on any map, the high country around Soda Springs belonged to the snow and to the people who knew how to live with it. The oldest traces here are what archaeologists call the Martis complex, not a tribe with a name it gave itself, but a way of life, identified by the dark basalt tools its people left behind, reaching back as far as 4,000 years. They left something else you can still see today: carvings, pecked into the glacier-polished granite of the summit. In one stretch of rock alone, there are more than 200 of them: circles, spirals, wavy lines, chains of strange symbols, and the unmistakable track of a bear. No one has ever deciphered what they mean. The Martis way of life seems to have faded from the summit around 1,500 years ago, at about the same moment the bow and arrow arrived in these mountains, and what became of those people is a question the carvings simply refuse to answer. The peoples who came after treated this pass not as a home, but as a meeting place. The Washoe, whose ancestral homeland reaches from Lake Tahoe up to this granite crest, gathered here each summer alongside the Nisenan-Maidu and the Miwok, climbing up out of the lowland heat to trade. Shells and acorns carried up from the western foothills changed hands for obsidian, and dried fish hauled up from the desert lakes to the east. And there was a reason they could get here at all. Donner Pass is not low. It sits above 7,000 feet, but it is the gentlest usable break in this whole stretch of the Sierra Crest, a place where the granite wall happens to dip, and the western approach climbs gradually instead of rearing up as a cliff. For thousands of years, the summit was a crossroads, a place you traveled through to reach somewhere else. That, more than anything, is the thread that runs through everything Soda Springs would later become. In the 1860s, that ancient crossroads became the single hardest obstacle in the most ambitious construction project the country had ever attempted: the Transcontinental Railroad. To link California to the rest of the United States, the Central Pacific had to drive a line of track straight over the top of the Sierra Nevada, over Donner Pass, just above Soda Springs, through some of the most unforgiving granite on the continent. The men who controlled the railroad, the financiers history would call the Big Four, sat in their offices down in Sacramento. The men who actually broke the mountain were almost all Chinese. They came by the thousands from the Pearl River Delta, near Canton, recruited to do work that nearly everyone else refused. At the summit, they faced a wall of solid granite, and the only way to the other side was straight through it. Tunnel number 6, more than 1,600 feet of rock that had to be bored by hand. They drilled holes with sledgehammers and chisels by candlelight deep inside the mountain, then packed them with black powder and unstable nitroglycerin and ran for cover. The rock gave way a foot or two a day, They worked through one of the worst winters ever recorded in these mountains. 44 storms between November of 1866 and May of the following year. Snow standing 18 feet deep at the summit and more than 40 feet falling in all. They dug passages through the drifts just to reach the rock face and lived for weeks at a time beneath the snow in a buried world of lantern light. Avalanches swept entire camps off the mountain in the night. They were paid about $30 a month, less than the white workers alongside them who also had their food provided. The Chinese crews bought their own, and when they died, the company wrote nothing down. That is the part that should stop you. The Central Pacific kept no record of Chinese deaths. None. Historians have been arguing about the number ever since, and the estimates do not merely differ, they are irreconcilable. Some put it at 50, others at several hundred, others at 1,000 or 2,000 or more. One newspaper in 1870 reported that 10 tons of bones had been shipped home to China for burial, which would mean something like 1,200 men. Another account of the very same train counted about 50 sets of remains. There is no way to bridge a gap that wide, and there never will be, because the men who could have closed it did not consider the question worth a ledger line. We know precisely how many feet of granite they moved each day. We do not know how many of them died doing it. The man driving them on was a hard-handed construction boss named James Strobridge, who answered in turn to Charles Crocker, one of the Big Four, and the pressure from Sacramento never once let up. To gain time on tunnel number 6, the engineers sank a vertical shaft straight down into the middle of the mountain and set crews drilling outward from the bottom in both directions, so the granite could be attacked from 4 faces at once instead of 2. It was punishing, round-the-clock labor, 3 shifts a day, 6 days a week. And still, they finished tunnel number 6 in about 16 months, far ahead of the 3 years the engineers had predicted. To keep the line open against the very snow that had killed them, the railroad then built something extraordinary. Miles of wooden snow sheds, long tunnels of timber bolted right over the tracks, so that for a stretch, the summit crossing ran almost entirely under a roof. People called it the longest house in the world. Through it, for the first time, California was stitched to the rest of the nation, and a tiny station sat right at the heart of the crossing. That station had a name before it had its famous one. From 1867, it was called Tinker's Station, after a hard-driving, hard-drinking teamster named Tinker who hauled freight between the mines and the mountains. But the name that stuck came from somewhere else entirely, and this is where the map plays a trick on you. The soda springs that gave Soda Springs its name are not in Soda Springs. They bubble up several miles to the south, down in the canyon of the North Fork of the American River, across the county line in Placer County. They were a genuine curiosity, water naturally charged with gas, rising cold and lively straight out of seams in the stone, in some places fizzing up through the very bed of the stream. The station borrowed the name of the famous springs down the canyon, kept it, and outgrew it. Today, the town called Soda Springs has no Soda Springs at all. Down at the real springs, one of the Big Four had decided the place was far too beautiful to be only a curiosity. Mark Hopkins, the quiet bookkeeper among the railroad's leaders, took 80 acres in the canyon and built a retreat. First, a grand log cabin for his family, then a 3-story hotel that could host 85 guests. Up here in the thin mountain air, the men who had grown rich on a railroad, their workers had died, building came to fish, to soak in the mineral water, and to escape the summer heat of the valley. It lasted until 1898, when the hotel burned to the ground at 3 in the morning. It carried no insurance, and it was never rebuilt. The land passed down through Hopkins's heirs and eventually to the Stanford family, and slowly faded. For a while, it seemed the whole story might simply slip back into the granite and be forgotten. Instead, up at the station, it was reinvented yet again, this time by a family with far less money and far more nerve. In 1924, a man named Oscar Jones bought a parcel of land beside the highway for $5,000. On the 10th of December, 1927, he opened the Soda Springs Hotel. His brother Herschel opened the Rainbow Tavern nearby the same season. And because this was the height of Prohibition, the Jones operation ran the way a great many mountain roadhouses did, a perfectly respectable hotel upstairs, and something rather different underneath. There was gambling in the basement, and liquor poured quietly on the side, except on the nights when word came down the line that the sheriff was making his rounds. The lodges and taverns strung along Highway 40 had worked out an early warning system. When the law set off up the mountain, they telephoned one another from one roadhouse to the next, and by the time the sheriff arrived, the cards were put away, and every glass held nothing but soda water. But the Joneses did something at Soda Springs that outlasted the gambling and the bootleg whiskey. They helped invent an industry. In those days, the state did not even bother to plow Highway 40 in winter. The snow simply closed the pass, and the only way in was by train. So the visitors who stepped off at the Soda Springs platform came for the one thing all that deep snow was good for. In 1929, Oscar's son Dennis cleared the trees and stumps off a slope behind the hotel, opening a run 40 feet wide. The hill was crowned by an aircraft beacon marking the transcontinental air route, and that gave it its name, Beacon Hill. California's first real ski school set up shop behind that old hotel. Within a few years came the first rope tows, the mountain lodges, and the Sierra Club's Claire Tappan Lodge, raised by volunteers and thrown open on Christmas Eve of 1934. Through that decade, the whole country caught ski fever, and the railroad began running special snow trains straight up from the San Francisco Bay, whole cars packed with city dwellers who had never stood on a pair of skis, stepping off at the summit for a weekend in the drifts. When the state at last began plowing Highway 40 in the early 1930s, the automobiles followed the trains, and the trickle of skiers became a flood. Soda Springs became, and remains to this day, the oldest continuously operating ski resort in California. An entire state learned to play in the snow on a hill that began as the backyard of a Prohibition-era hotel. Today, almost none of this is obvious to the people speeding over the pass on Interstate 80. The railroad still runs, but the old summit tunnels were bypassed in 1993, and Tunnel Number 6 now stands silent and empty, its granite walls covered in graffiti, the drill marks of the men who bored it still visible in the stone. The mineral springs still bubble cold out of the rock down in the canyon. The carvings are still there, exposed on the polished granite for anyone who knows where to look, protected now and fragile and worth walking around rather than across. And the little ski hill behind the vanished hotel is still turning, more than 90 winters on. 3 names sit clustered on the modern map, within a mile or two of one another: Soda Springs, Norden, and the Old Summit. And almost no one passing below realizes that this handful of cabins and ski lifts was once the hinge on which an entire continent swung. If you go, leave the freeway and take the old road over the summit. Find the petroglyphs along the old highway, a few hundred yards, and 4,000 years from the asphalt. Stand at the pass in winter, in the same snow that once buried whole work camps, and look up at the mountain those men went into by candlelight. Consider how many different kinds of history are stacked one on top of another in this small, easily missed place. A trading ground, a graveyard nobody mapped, a rich man's playground, a speakeasy, and the cradle of California skiing. All of it hidden under the drifts at Soda Springs. Many people will never visit Soda Springs. Many people never knew any of this happened. But now you know. That's the story of Soda Springs, California, and we're just getting started. If this is your first time here at Los California, welcome. Every week, we go deep on the towns, the disasters, the scandals, the forgotten stories, and the hidden history that made California what it is today. Subscribe so you don't miss a single episode, and leave a comment below telling us which California city or town you want us to cover next. We'll see you there.